Okay, so we're into it now. This is the introduction to service providers in a SAML federation. So, first question, what is a service provider? So, I found these definitions on the various places around. So SAML Service Provider, it's generally abbreviated to SP. It's a system entity that receives and accepts authentication assertions in conjunction with a single sign-on profile of a security assertion markup language, SAML. So basically gets something else to do an authentication, accepts that authentication assertion from that third party, which is in this case our IDPs, our SAML IDPs, and it works within a single sign-on environment. So in our SAML domain, a SAML relying party, which is another name for service provider, is any system entity that receives and accepts this information or information from another system entity. In this case, our particular interest is a SAML relying party, and a SAML party receives and accepts a SAML assertion issued by a SAML authority. Here it'll be IDP. So that's a bit sort of high level, detailed sort of description. I also found this much more simpler description. So an SP, it's the system that relies on information supplied to it by an IDP. It's also known as a relying party. It has its own local access policies defined, and they define whether the subject, the user in this case, may access local resources. So it's a piece of the puzzle that basically sits in front of the resources that users want to access and decides if they're entitled to use the service or use the content or not, or the resource or not. There's a bit of background. SAML, it's a security access markup language. It's a standard. It's a XML, describes XML messages exchanged between IDPs and SPs. There are two versions. Most people are now dealing with version 2, and version 1 has been end of life for many years now. We're trying to remove it from federations. So when you start your federation, just start it up with version 2 only. That should be fairly easy. With SAML, it's got some advantages. It's platform neutral. It improves online experience for the users. It's supported by many applications. So there's a couple of open source options. There's plenty of software as a service options and third-party commercial offerings of SAML. It increases the security around providing services to users, and there's strong commercial and open source support for SAML. There's also OpenID Connect, which is another protocol. It's also starting to take off, or has been taking off for a while around the place, so it's a bit of a competitor for SAML. And a lot of federations are looking at doing both SAML and OpenID Connect together. But we'll just concentrate here on SAML and how it sort of fits in with our federation. So there's some use cases for using SAML. The one that we're looking at today is really about identity federations and using SAML to provide our identity federations. And the part we're looking at is a service provider part of SAML. SAML also provides web single sign-on, and it also allows for attribute-based authorization. So those in a bit more detail. But before that, the service provider's role within the whole SAML situation. The SAML service provider's main role is to protect content based on a successful authentication at an approved IDP, one that the service provider knows about, and authorization decisions that are based on attributes that are provided by that IDP. So, as I said, the service provider protects some sort of content, some sort of file system, some sort of service, some sort of stuff, and it delegates the authentication off to the identity provider, and the identity provider provides back some information about the user that the service provider can make decisions about if that user is entitled to use the service or not. And as you can see in the picture on the left, on the right, there's a whole lot of backwards and forwards between the user agent, their browser, to the service provider, back to the identity provider, and passing SAML information or XML information backwards and forwards, all defined by the SAML specification. And it's a service provider that we're looking at today, and its role is to protect the content. I'm really today going to also concentrate on the Shibboleth service provider for a couple of reasons. One, I know most about that particular service provider implementation, and two, it's fairly easy to set up on your server. It basically wraps around either Apache or the IIS web server and allows you to protect content delivered by Apache or IIS. It consists of a daemon running the shibd process. Operates on most major operating systems, all Linuxes, and Windows will run Shibboleth service provider. And I believe even Macs can run the service provider without any major issues. There's versions for that around as well. It also provides a module, the mod shib module, which is natively plugs into your Apache web server or your IIS web server. And it's used to add configuration options to those two web servers to allow you to protect the content that you're providing via your service. So the Shibboleth service provider can protect any web content by enforcing user authentication within your federation or with your federation. So as you can see on the diagram on the right, you have your mod shib plugin. It talks to the shibd daemon on your server, and then it can protect any content that is provided through your Apache, things like PHP or Perl, even CGI scripts, or for .NET if you're running IIS. And you can also have it protect Jetty and Tomcat instances by using mod proxy to proxy across to those particular services to sit behind Apache. So all the authentication stuff happens at Apache, and it just sort of passes information down to those particular applications that sit within your behind your Apache. So Shibboleth can protect access to files, directories, or locations with simple access control rules, or it can actually pass attributes down to the applications that can then themselves make those authorization decisions. The Shibboleth SP, so once a user has successfully authenticated, his or her user attributes are available to the web server environment. Therefore, all web applications, PHP, Perl, .NET, etc., running inside the web server can also use these attributes. Attributes are just read from the web server's environment, so you can get mail in PHP using a $_server type bit of PHP to pull out that attribute. You can also get all of the attributes that are passed. You can get identity information, you can get some information about the affiliation of a person if those attributes have been selected to be released by the IDPs to your services. In order to protect your Java applications, the servlet container like Tomcat or Jetty must be operated behind a front-end Apache or IIS web server, as shown in the diagram on the previous page, which we'll skip back to. So it's using the mod proxy, as I said before, to get that information and sit behind the Apache, which then does the authentication through Shibboleth. So protecting content. With the Shibboleth SP installed and configured, it's possible to protect all sorts of content. You've got your static web pages, which is just using the Apache configuration to do the protecting and authentication. There are collaboration tools, your wikis, your blogs, scheduling and voting tools. There's one that we get to use fairly regularly as part of EduGain to vote on membership of EduGain. It's protected by the Shibboleth service provider. Full-blown applications, so your Jetties and your Tomcats running full web applications sitting behind Apache can be protected using Shibboleth and your federation. You can also have devices such as your telescopes, your remote labs, your beamlines, I should say, and other tools that are all driven by web servers or web applications that sit behind Apache or IIS. There are a number of such physical devices that are controlled by web servers that are running in our federation in Australia as we speak. And the number keeps growing of these sort of tools and services that we make available to our federation members. So don't think with inside the box. Don't be limited to the things that you think you can use your federation for. Anything that has a web service or web front end can be protected by your federation. You're limited basically by your own imagination or the imagination of your service providers to what sort of stuff that you want to have being protected and authenticated by your federation. There are, however, some limitations to SAML. SAML is primarily for web-based applications. It doesn't do the following things very well. It doesn't do Wi-Fi. It's not for Wi-Fi. EduRoam is for Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi access. A lot of folk you'll find get EduRoam and federations confused when they first start looking at these things. We still have people come up to us and say, oh, we're trying to log in through EduRoam into these services. They've just got it wrong. We try and correct them, but mostly they'll just sort of keep going. They're fine with it. Mobile applications are also difficult to do with SAML. It's probably much easier to use OpenID Connect, which is why a lot of federations are looking at using OpenID Connect as an option as a protocol for their federation. Command line access. SSHing into your servers to do command line stuff is also very difficult to do in SAML. PKI tends to be the easiest way to do it, but there is also a service that the UK Federation run called Ascent, and that is specifically designed to allow for non-web-based services such as access by SSH to your using your federation to do the authentication. There are a lot of moving parts with the Ascent. It's got Radius servers, it's got all sorts of stuff sort of hanging off it. But the UK Federation are happily running it in production, so if you want to know more about Ascent, we'd happily get some of the UK Federation to come and talk about that at a future sort of meeting or webinar type thing. I'm happy to sort of help arrange those sort of discussions as we progress the development of our federations across the region. File access to file systems through FTP or secure copy or Samba, etc., is also fairly difficult, or if not difficult, impossible to do with SAML, and you need other options to get file access stuff happening. The other things that are also difficult to do with SAML is single logout or federated logout. It can be done, but it's not easy because it's a lot of the logout stuff is about destroying cookies that are holding sessions. And SAML, once you've destroyed the SAML cookies, you've also got the application cookies that need to be destroyed. And SAML or Shibboleth knows nothing about the application cookies. So getting all of your applications to work nicely in a single logout environment is going to be very, very difficult to achieve. And there's also no guarantee that you've actually completely logged out of everything that you've logged into in the single sign-on type environment. So single logout is difficult. Running in shared environments where you've got computer labs, public kiosks, lecture theatre, podium type machines, where they're shared by many users, is also a difficult thing that needs to be considered in a single sign-on environment. So these are more issues about single sign-on rather than just SAML. Having single sign-on means that the user's browser is connected to many services with a single username password that they enter. If the user walks away to go to the bathroom or to get a cup of coffee, then their machine, if left unattended, is vulnerable for someone to come up and log into services that the user wasn't expecting to have logged into. So these things need to be considered by your organisations as they deploy single sign-on across their institutions. These things are still being considered in Australia as universities continue to roll out more and more single sign-on across their university and into the federation. The other thing that's very difficult to do is deprovisioning. And that is that when a user finishes with the university, it's very difficult to tell all the services that that user has previously logged into that user is no longer a member of the university. The user won't be able to log into a service because they won't have credentials at the university, but having the service know for sure that the user has actually left the university, is not just gone on long service leave or an extended holiday or on an overseas secondment, but they've actually left the organisation. It's very difficult because the service has no way to actually query out of, without the user having logged in, to know that the user is no longer there. So these things will be around. There are sort of workarounds, but they're not very pretty, and we'll have a look at some of these things a bit, not in detail not this webinar, but in future webinars. Probably more in discussions rather than webinars, because these things are about how you sort of resolve some of these issues without actually providing a complete solution. Okay, moving on, requirements for running your service provider. So, back to the federation rules we go. Your federation rules should define the sort of organisations that can join. So we've looked at this last time in identity providers, and I've got the same piece of information here. From our AAF rules, it applies equally to service providers as it does to identity providers. So a service provider is a university will provide services, or a vocational training institution. Government and commercial research institutions will most likely have services or things that they want to share with researchers and students at universities. Governments and non-commercial service organisations delivering products or services to the education and research sector. The number of, or the types of people or organisations that can be service providers is generally much wider than those that are identity providers. You'll get a lot more commercial product service providers, things that are providing journals, access to knowledge bases, access to physical infrastructure, access to software, access to all sorts of stuff that are commercially based, will potentially be service providers in your federation. So Rule 4.1.2 really comes into play here for us, in that it's around a service being of value to the education and research sector. And that's a fairly broad definition that allows many types of services in. And finally, anything else that's approved by our executive committee from time to time. So occasionally something will be sort of fall through the cracks that we need a sort of an executive decision on. So once they've passed that rules step for us, they can join, but they also need to have something to share. So what is it that's being shared with users in the federation? Is there a need to restrict access to what's being shared? So if it's something that's generally publicly available to everybody, there's no real value in putting up a federation front door on it, unless you want to sort of know who's using this particular service. If you want to start counting heads, how many university people are using it as compared to how many public people might be a reason to restrict access. You might also want to restrict access based on licensing restrictions. So if you purchase some software or a software license to something like lynda.com, which is just a training video type service, and you want to restrict it to a particular department or a particular school within your institutions, then putting up a federation, putting it into the federation and restricting it by some sort of attributes that are provided to Lynda will allow you to restrict usage based on your licensing requirements. Restricting based on research activity, so there might be some research activity where you only want a few people within a number of institutions to have access. You might have a limited resource that's available to share, so you might have a small amount of, or just a single telescope that you want to drive. You can't have everyone looking through the telescope at all parts of the sky at the same time. So you've got a limited resource which you need to share effectively. So putting up a federation in front of that, knowing who's using it, and putting appropriate restrictions around that will certainly help. There might be content that is specific to each user. You might have a teaching and learning system, your Moodles or your Blackboards or others, and each user has their own individual view. So putting authentication in front of that makes sense. And then making that available to multiple institutions. So you have people from multiple institutions sharing that same Moodle or Blackboard content, if you want to go that way. There are some other benefits that putting services into a federation will bring to the users. Users will start to see more and more single sign-on. They'll have one username, one password to access everything, rather than the many, many usernames and passwords that they've probably got already provisioned to them. There is an option to provision on the fly, so there's less integration work that may be needed to integrate services. And once the services have been integrated into a federation once, it can then easily be integrated into many federations or into many identity providers. And as I said, there's one username, one password for many services. So the more services you have federated, the better off your users will be. There are also some benefits for the organisations that are providing these services to the federation, in that they have a reduced workload in managing passwords, because they're no longer having to issue passwords for users, because the users' passwords are being maintained by their home institution or home organisation. They also benefit from the automated provisioning that comes with federation, if they so choose to do that. Again, that's about integration. Once it's integrated with one identity provider, it can be integrated with many. And they also get the benefit of being able to see users' attributes, which they can use for authorization or personalization, a whole raft of things that attributes are of value for. And we'll talk more about attributes at the APAN conference, I think. There's a session in there, or some time in there, that we'll talk about that. Service providers. There's a bit more detail about service providers and their benefits. So they outsource the user account management to identity providers. There's no more lost password recovery done at the service provider end. It's all done at the identity provider. Creation and management of users is significantly reduced because they can be done on the fly. The storage and security of users' credentials is no longer a risk of the service provider. Just becomes the risk of the identity provider. They've already got that risk because they're already issuing usernames and passwords. That risk is significantly reduced for service providers who no longer have to deal with usernames and passwords. We've had a few incidents of passwords being stolen or captured or taken, and that can be very embarrassing for service providers. So if the service providers don't have the usernames and passwords, there's nothing to steal. Authorization can be based on users' attributes. So there's more information that the user provides to the service through the identity provider, the more better the authorization can be for that particular service. There are a couple of standard attributes that will help in this space. It's eduperson affiliation, which can give you some coarse-grained authorization about the type of user that's trying to log in. There's the eduperson entitlement. It's got some very limited use in federations to date, but it should be used, I think, a lot more. And there's federated groups. There is a possibility to create federated groups across institutions. But this is a complete topic into itself. We're starting to see more and more federated group type services appear. We've recently had one startup in Australia which identifies a group of researchers interested in astronomy. and they're given access to the Murchison project, which is the big square kilometre array, or the Australian part of the square kilometre array that's being deployed in Western Australia. So there's federated groups that allow people from different organisations from across the world that can use the federation to access information, data and so forth that's available from that particular science project. And as I said, deprovisioning federated accounts is difficult. So it's difficult for service providers to know when a user is no longer entitled to access the service. Generally, the user won't be able to log into the service once they've been deprovisioned or removed from the institution, but the service provider will have difficulty actually knowing when that event occurred. There's no way to really trigger that event to tell service providers that the deprovisioning has occurred. Service provider software, so if you're using the Shibboleth SP, open source software, the applications that sit behind any Apache or IIS server will work quite happily with the Shibboleth software. So I think we've covered that fairly well. There are other service provider softwares, other options around that can function as SAML service providers. Some of these, however, will have difficulty fitting into the identity federation model. If you're looking at using something different to Shibboleth or simple SAML PHP, then you need to ask the question that can it consume federation metadata? Can it interact or provide a discovery mechanism? So discovery is where the user is asked which organisation they're from. And does it provide a single metadata usable by all IDPs? Some service providers will provide a separate instance of their metadata for each IDP that they want to interact with. And that doesn't really work well within the federated model. In some cases, service providers just don't work well in an identity federation, and they may need to be connected directly to each IDP. Which wishes to use that particular service. And we've seen that a lot in Australia in the AAF, with a lot of identity providers connecting services bilaterally or directly to their IDP because they don't really fit within the federation model that well. But a lot of services will fit nicely within your federation. And there's even just a benefit of having an IDP that non-federatable services can easily plug into as well. So if you've got that infrastructure, then you have options for those services that don't play well in federated identity. The final thing you'll need to do is to register your service provider into your federation. The service provider will have some metadata that describes its various aspects, and this metadata needs to be shared across the federation. Federation Operator SPs. So as a federation operator, what sort of services would you consider providing to your members? So as the federation operator, you probably want to federate the federation registry tool, so it makes it easier for IDPs and service providers to add and manage the federation entities and their metadata within your federation. Some sort of attribute validator or attribute reflector type tool is always useful as a testing tool. We've got a fairly elaborate one that records a person's attributes, and when they come back again, it will tell them if those attributes have changed over time. This is particularly useful when upgrading an IDP. That will tell you if a person's identity information has been changed as part of that upgrade. We've had that save us a few times. If you're running a virtual home IDP out of as part of the Federation Operator tools, it's probably useful to have an admin page if you want to allow people to register visitors into that virtual home IDP. If you're running a support page or a support tool, you might want to add that to the Federation as a Federation tool so people can log into that using the Federation identity. We use a thing called Freshdesk, and that is also federated, so we can log into it using the federation, and all of our members can also log into that particular tool. A lot of third-party software as a service type support tools will allow for a SAML type authentication to occur. As an NREN, you might also want to consider some other tools. Our NREN in Australia, ARNet, runs some of these things. They run FileSender under the name of CloudStore, and I've sent out the previous videos of these webinars using FileSender to a number of folk. Use FileSender to send other stuff around. It's a really nice tool for sending large files that don't fit within the normal email restrictions. Zoom's another one that you might consider. This is one of those services that integrates directly to each IDP, so there's some extra work that needs to happen there. There's some edge of roam support tools which can be federated to allow people to do their edge of roam support, to do whatever stuff in the edge of roam space. And there's probably other tools you might want to consider running as an NREN. But you don't want to run all the tools. You want to let your collaborators, your members also provide services, and also gather up services that are available on Edge Again. We'll talk about Edge Again further, probably after APAN's finished. And I think Brooke will also be doing a talk at APAN on Edge Roam. Sorry, not Edge Roam, Edge Again. Okay, so how does the service provider fit into an identity federation? We've seen this picture a few times now on the right here. Each federated service provider will have its metadata registered in the federation registry. The service provider will consume the federation metadata, so it then knows about all of the IDPs in the federation. All the IDPs will know about the service provider and how to communicate it to it or with it, because its metadata is also in the federation metadata, which is also consumed by all the IDPs. The IDP can then allow any user from any IDP to log in if that's what it wants, or it can apply restrictions based on the attributes or based on the IDPs that it wants to allow to access that particular service and the content that it provides. So each service provider has its own metadata. On the left there's some metadata. It looks the same as all sorts of other metadata. Each service will have its own unique entity ID, and the piece of metadata I've got here is our status service in our federation, and its entity ID just looks like a URL, status.test.af.edu/shibboleth. It's just unique. And the metadata also includes a bunch of technical, contact, organisational and other information which is useful within the federation to make the whole thing fit together. The metadata is shared, as I said, for the entity to work within the mesh federation. Its metadata needs to be shared between the entities. So IDPs need to know about the SPs, SPs need to know about the IDPs. And the mesh federation is achieved again through the federation metadata. And here in our pilots, we're using the Jagger federation tool to curate the federation metadata that is used to create the federation, and manage this metadata. And as you can see, Jagger creates the metadata. It's just a great big file, and every so often the IDPs and SPs will go and fetch a new version of the metadata. The metadata is signed cryptographically by Jagger in the middle there, or the federation operator, and it's that signature that tells the service providers and identity providers that the metadata hasn't been tampered with in its travels from the federation operator out to the IDP or SP. And that's what we'll be talking about in our next chat on federation, about how to sign metadata. At the moment, we'll live with unsigned metadata. So now, in your registering your federation, registering the service provider. So in our pilot federation, Jagger's where we register the thing. and its metadata is collected. To register your SP and Jagger, you'll need the following. Let's just say the metadata of your SP. Fix that up shortly. Information about the organisation to whom the SP is being registered. Contact information, so support, administrative, technical, and so forth. Again, we recommend that use a group or positional email address rather than a personal email address, if you can, or get your organisations to use group or positional email addresses. There's a better chance that those email addresses will continue to work for a longer duration than personal email addresses. And some user interface information about the organisation, some policy information, some local location information. Oops. Once you've registered your SP, it will require approval from the Federation operator. We've seen that before. The tool has a workflow which says once you've registered something, the Federation operator needs to approve it. So this is the homework I mentioned earlier. I'll be putting up some instructions and some code into a GitHub repository, which I'll be creating in the next few days, to set up a simple attribute reflector application. And the instructions and code will be provided via the task force list. I think I've got that. It should be taskforce-IAM. This service will request a number of user attributes when the user logs in, and the attributes will be displayed back to the user, so the user can see that the attributes are what they expect. It's basically an attribute mirror, which is why I've got a sort of pretty picture of the mirror there. This could possibly be the first service that you add to your pilot federation, and it's a good test to see that things are working well, that service providers are actually getting attributes that they expect. So hopefully in the next few days you'll see some email on the task force list pointing at this homework that we can get you to do. It shouldn't take more than a couple of hours to set up this service provider in your federation. It's going to just be a fairly simple PHP application. The trickiest part is going to be setting up the Shibboleth side of things, but that's fairly straightforward. So as I say, a couple of hours and you should be good. Available software options, pretty much the same as the IDPs. For open source, you've got Shibboleth, you've got simple SAML PHP, and probably a number of other open source offerings that are out there that will allow you to run a service provider, a SAML service provider. Commercial offerings, there's plenty of these around. Your Microsofts, Pings, Optas, and so forth. There's plenty of options available if you want to pay some cash or have somebody else do a whole lot of the work for you. And I've just got the one reference there. So that's it for today. I'm going to open it up for any questions and have a look at the chat so we can have a couple there. Okay, so Brooks put in the right address. Are there any questions or any comments or feedback that anyone sort of wants to say about how we're going with these particular webinars? The floor is open. Sure. So service providers are a much easier beast to deal with than identity providers. To get them set up, it's very much easier install. There's not much, if any, branding to deal with. There's no directories or other integrations that you need to deal with behind the scenes. It's just configuring a piece of software and configuring an Apache server to sit behind it. Do we have a practical? Do you have? There's nothing. We've only got 2 afternoons worth of content, but I'm happy to have a morning or just sit around somewhere at APAN 46, and work through anything you want to work through. We can set up an IDP, we can set up a service provider, we can have a look at Jagger. If you want to send some ideas about what you want to do one morning at APAN, I'm happy to do that with you guys, and I'm sure Brooke will be happy to assist as well.
Yeah, hi Terry. Thanks for your presentation. Hi all. I know that when people are setting up federations, and as we've been developing them in Europe, a lot of people have asked, what do we focus on? Do we focus on identity providers or do we focus on service providers? And unfortunately, the reality is you have to focus on both, right? Because you can't log into something if it's not there, and you can't log in if you don't have identity providers to kick off that process. But I think what we've seen is when federations first started and when Terry and I began in this game, it was the federation operator that was developing and making every service available. And these days, this is no longer the case. It's no longer needed. Support for our institutions still exists, but increasingly there are a lot of commercial offerings or services available via Interfederation and EduGain, so you don't need to spend a huge amount of time in the service provider area. And the service providers that Terry detailed, things like the attribute reflector and actually logging into your federation management tool is really the key for federation operators. And there isn't a requirement now for you to develop every single service that's going to appear in your federation.
Yep, that's right. When we started, there was very few services out there, so we actually put some money out to get people to invest some effort into setting up services. But as Brooke said, there's a lot more services that are available, a lot more software that you can find that sort of gives you guidance on how to configure it up for Shibboleth, that will have Shibboleth options built in, so it's a much easier place to start to set up a federation at the moment. I've got a question about install guides. I did promise last time to put together a bit of a package of install guides. Last week was a bit of a write-off for me, but hopefully this week Dahlia and I will be able to knock together a quick list of guides that are available or options for setting up your IDPs. Different federations have done it in different ways. In the AAF, we've moved to a installer, which means you just run the installer and it does all the heavy lifting for you. There's very little configuration left to do, a bit of branding work. Other federations have great big long lists of dot points of things that you need to do. It depends on how configured you want it. We've tried to get everyone to have a very similar configuration in Australia, so having an installer helps that. I know that Canary and one of the other federations also have an installer, and some of the other federations have gone down the path of setting up a software as a service type option. So Toby's stated one of the areas you may look into is the library. University libraries usually have already subscribed to a number of online resources and publishers, and many of those are probably SAML ready already. So yes, that's a good point, Toby, thanks for that. There are a lot of publisher services, and a lot of thanks can go to the UK Federation for getting those already up and running in the Federation. A lot of those will also be available through EduGain, so once we get to that point, a lot of those services will become available to your federations fairly quickly. Okay, so our next presentation is in 2 weeks' time on the 17th of July. I'll send around the invitations next Monday or Tuesday for that particular one. And we'll be looking at discovery services and setting up federation metadata, signed federation metadata, and getting that done. So hopefully by the time we come to New Zealand, we'll have a few pilot federations that we can actually have a look at and see how you guys are going. I believe Pakistan's already well on the way to setting up theirs, and I think Indonesia's also tracking along fairly well. If you want to give a presentation at APAN, it doesn't matter if you're attending or not, we can accept presentations remotely on what you've been doing and how far you've progressed with your identity federations. That would be great to hear about at APAN 46 as well. So thanks for your time today. If there are no more questions, then I'll call it a day. If you have any questions, shoot them off to the task force list or shoot them off to me directly, and we'll have an offline conversation. I'm sure Brooke will be happy to answer questions as well. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll stop recording now. Let's see, stop.